Hi everybody, this is Meredith from the Witty Gritty Paper Co. and today we are going to be starting something that I'm really excited about. If you've been a subscriber for a while, you may remember that I did a series last year about beginner watercolor exercises, and it got such a great response that I knew I wanted to do another series, and I decided that I would make it about something that I've really been enjoying these past couple months, and that is doing portraits in watercolors. So this is going to be a 4-part series. We're going to talk all about the different elements of a strong watercolor portrait in the first 3, and then in part 4 we will paint a whole watercolor portrait together. So it should be a lot of fun. Today though, we are going to be talking just about the sketch. But before we get into that, let me just make a note of why I think portraiture and watercolors is not as publicized as it should be. When you think of a formal portrait, you probably first think of oils or acrylics or even photography, just something more traditional. But the truth is, I feel, and of course I'm a little biased, but I feel that watercolors are the best thing to do portraits in because of their transparency. You can go so many different directions with a watercolor portrait. You can make them, super realistic, just insanely realistic, or you can go really artsy. And the skin tones that you can make, the realism of them can just be, I don't want to say mind-blowing, but I think that's what I mean. So anyway, watercolor portraits, I think, are underappreciated, and we're out to change that here. So let's talk about the sketch. So first things first, before you even start your sketch, is you're probably going to want to find some reference photos. So you don't need to find a reference photo. You can make up people if you want, but in my opinion, you should always at least start with reference photos because it is a lot harder than you think to just stare at a blank piece of paper and come up with a face that looks realistic and emotional. So I definitely recommend you start with finding some reference photos. So I have 2 here. And both of them I found on royalty-free photo websites, and I think I have a video about finding reference photos on the channel, so you can look to find that if you're interested in some sources. But I caution you against just Google imaging. You want to use either photos that you took yourself; those are totally fine. Ones you have permission to use from the photographer, or ones that are royalty-free, like these 2. So here's why I picked them. This first one, I love the color of her hair. It's this really pretty sort of brownish blonde, and I think she has really interesting features, and it's an interesting sort of look that she's giving the camera. But the key to picking strong reference photos for portraits is picking photos that have like really strong bones, but aren't too finished, so to speak, so that painting them would sort of be like a moot point, like the painting wouldn't be as interesting as the photo. So you want to pick photos that are good but aren't like amazing. So you want to pick ones that have a lot of emotion. So here's the other one I picked. As you can see, the mood is quite a bit different. First of all, it's in black and white. That doesn't really make much of a difference to me, but the mood's quite different. You can see it's a little boy, and he looks very intense. Maybe even a little hurt or resentful or maybe determined. It's kind of hard to cipher out the exact emotion, but I picked them both because I really liked the texture of his skin. I like the expression that he's giving the camera, and her too. I loved her freckles. She has freckles on the left side of her nose, and just a couple on the other side. And I thought those would be really interesting to paint. And I liked her hoodie too. I thought it'd be fun to get some texture in there. Anyway, that's why I picked these 2 photos. So now let's talk about actually turning them into sketches. So one thing that we are not going to do here is we're not going to turn this into a drawing lesson. Drawing is a whole other topic, and has to be approached a lot differently than painting in most cases. And I would not want to bore you with what it would take to really give a complete drawing lesson in a single video. So we're not going to get into that, but I definitely recommend that if you don't feel like you're a very strong sketcher, that you either look on YouTube or look on Skillshare. There are a lot of great resources for becoming a better sketcher, taught by a lot of great teachers. So I definitely recommend that if you don't feel like you're a very strong sketcher, that you maybe practice, because sketching people is, a lot harder and a lot different than sketching even just objects or landscapes. I mean, it's a lot harder because the slightest little variation in the shape of the features and it won't look like the person. And that's okay. It doesn't have to look exactly like them. You know, if we wanted it to look exactly the same, why would we paint it? We want it to be more interesting and different. But if you are trying to create a portrait that looks just like somebody, like if you're painting somebody that you knew, then you definitely want to either feel strong in your sketching skills, or you can also, if you want, you can use a tracing board. So here's my smaller tracing board, and I won't power it up here. I have a video about tracing boards as well on the channel, I believe, so you can look for that if you want some more info. But if you do not feel strong as a sketcher and you don't really want to become a sketcher, what you can do is you can take your photos, you can put a piece of paper over them, and you can just trace. And some people will tell you that that's cheating and that it's not real art and you shouldn't do it, but the truth is, we're here to paint. So if you don't want to become a particularly talented sketcher, or don't feel that you can, that's all right. That shouldn't stop you from becoming a good painter, and it certainly shouldn't stop you from painting people. So if you want to do that, especially if you're just starting out, and you don't want to take the time, if you want to trace, that's totally fine in my opinion. Some artists would argue with me, but I think anything that makes it easier for you to create things you really like is not a bad thing. So that's one thing you can do if you don't feel strong in your natural ability. Okay, so now let's talk about the actual do's and don'ts of creating a good sketch for painting. Okay, so let's start with our girl in the hoodie here. So I did 2 sketches of both of these paintings. So here is the first one. As you can see, I sketched her a little bit bigger than she is in the photo here to highlight her features. And this sketch would not be good for painting. Here's why. As you can see, I've already gone in and textured her hair. I drew in all the reflections in her eyes. I even drew in some of her freckles. And this is not your goal when you're sketching to make a watercolor portrait, because all of that texture, all of that beautiful detail, that is what you're going to add with your paint. So if you want to create a realistic sketch of someone, I mean, more power to you, because those can be absolutely beautiful. But if you do want to make a painting, then the kind of sketch you should start out with should look more like our second sketch. So this is very bare bones. This is basically just the shape of her head, the shape of her eyes, and the shape of her lips and nose. And that's more important than you might think. If the shape of the features is a little off, or if they're too far away or too close in any place, then that's what's going to make it not look like the person. You know, you can do an absolutely beautiful painting on top, but ultimately if your sketch was the wrong shape, it still won't look like an exact likeness. So the bottom line is that the painting cannot save the sketch. So if the sketch does not look like the person, at least, you know, in a broad sense, then the painting won't either, even if the painting is beautiful and the shading is beautiful. So although this is a prettier sketch, this is going to work much better for our painting because I can add all my texture and all my interest with my paints. And you can do that. Don't worry about, I don't know how to paint hair. You will. We're going to get into that. But sketching hair, that's not what we're here to do. This is, you know, there's nothing wrong with this, but I have to leave it as a sketch. I couldn't paint on it if I wanted to. Now, neither of these are done on watercolor paper, so I really shouldn't be painting them in here anyway, but this is just an example. The other thing that you would want to do to this sketch, if you were going to paint on it, actually the last thing you'd want to do is you'd want to make sure that your lines were light enough. So you'd want to take an eraser and just sort of, with like medium pressure, go over the whole sketch. You want to make it as light as possible so that you can still see it, but so that it's not going to show up after you've painted over it. Because as you may or may not know, once you paint over a pencil sketch with watercolor paint, it's not going to erase. It's basically permanent once you paint over your sketch. So you don't really want dark lines showing through your painting, because your actual painting is going to be where all the beauty and the detail comes in your portrait. You just want the bare bones. You just want the shapes. and you just want to barely be able to see them. So this is probably very hard to see on camera now, but this is exactly what you would want if you were starting a watercolor portrait. You just want the shapes. So let's look at the other one too, like case studies here. So here's our other photo. And once again, I did 2 sketches. I did this one, and as you can see, there's just a ton of beautiful, very interesting texture on his face. And I drew in some of that. I actually could have drawn in even more of it, but there's detail on his lips. I drew in almost all the reflections in his eyes. This is a more detailed sketch. Once again, a pretty sketch, but not ideal. Even this, which I didn't, draw on the texture of his hair because he doesn't have any that's visible in the reference photo, but even so, the rest of these features are still too detailed. I'll zoom in a little so you can see. They're still too detailed to really be ideal for painting a portrait on top of them. And it's not to say that you can't use watercolors on top of a sketched portrait that is, more detailed. You can, but I think that they often end up looking kind of like an afterthought, and we don't want that if we're doing the kind of portraits that I think are the most enjoyable. So once again, this would be more appropriate to use as a sketch foundation for a portrait in watercolors. So we can flip a little. So it's like, this is too detailed, this is too textured. So not ideal, ideal, even though you can barely see it. Not ideal, ideal. Same thing here. Pretty interesting, but not ideal, much more ideal. Just the shapes. Your paint is going to give you all the texture and all the detail and the interest that you need. Trust your painting skills, because that's what we're here to develop. Don't worry about the sketch too much. If you want to trace, go ahead and trace. Don't worry about it too much. And if you want to sketch it yourself and it doesn't look exactly like them, or it does, or whatever, if you want to sketch yourself, you're confident in that, that's awesome too. The bottom line is that your sketch does not need to be much more than the outline of the person's face and their features. So I hope everybody is excited about this new series. I really am. I've been working on it for quite some time, and I'm very excited to share what I've learned with you about painting portraits. I found it to be one of the most rewarding things to paint. And I know we didn't do any actual painting today, but we will get into it. Next lesson, we're going to be talking about skin tones, so that'll be a lot of fun. So stay tuned for part 2 of our beginner portrait series for watercolorists. And if you like this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to see more content like it. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Bye.